Kia ora, everybody. My name is Raewyn Blakely. I'm the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Food and Grocery Council. I want to start by making sure you're all aware that we are recording today's webinar, and that's so that we can share the webinar with people in future, and this can be a resource available on our website. We will have time for questions and answers later, and it is a great pleasure of mine to be hosting today's webinar, Winning in Summer, Winning Together. And with me today, I have Hamish Jackson, who is Head of Supply Chain at Nestle, and Matt Dean, Head of Operations at Arnott's. And they are the real experts about supplying well in summer. Today's session will cover the summer context, planning and review, the checklist that we've developed and how to use it. We'll have Matt talk about the supplier view, and then we'll move to questions and answers. Before I start with the session and hand over to Hamish, I'm going to talk a little bit about what New Zealand Food and Grocery Council does, so that those of you who aren't members, and we give you a very warm welcome to today's webinar, understand a little bit more about what we do. So we're a voluntary trade association that represents manufacturers and suppliers of food, beverage, grocery products in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have members who are the very largest companies to emerging companies breaking into what we all know is a highly competitive market. We also have members who are the companies that support them. Our sector is a very significant sector. We know that the grocery sector in New Zealand is worth 25 billion, and many of our members are contributing to exports as well. So it's a very large and important sector that affects everybody in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this topic came out of a working group that we run as the New Zealand Food and Grocery Council. We run a supply chain working group. We run a number of other working groups as well. And these are very important platforms that allow our members to get together and work on issues that they are facing in a joint way and find solutions and activities that can help members share case studies, share lessons that people have learnt from various experiences they've had. And the supply chain working group has been working in this area to look at how they can do better with the supply of the summer. Our supply chain working group has representatives from the supplier network. We also work with the retailers and have the 3 retailers represented: Foodstuffs North Island, South Island and Woolworths New Zealand. They are all represented on our working group, and that's a great way for us to hear all of the perspectives and work together for efficiencies and best practice in supply chain. The Winning in Summer, Winning Together Toolkit came about because of an idea that originated in Australia, where they faced similar challenges with having stock at appropriate levels over their busy summer season. And they developed some material to help suppliers in conjunction with retailers as well. And so we used that shamelessly and with their permission and developed it further for the New Zealand context. And that's where the working group really comes into the fore, because you have that perspective from both the supplier network, large and small. Logistics companies are also represented, and of course the very important retailer perspective who are receiving the goods from suppliers. And we've gone through a review process and updated this material. And I really do want to thank particularly Hamish and Matt for their efforts on that working group, and Hamish particularly for leading a lot of this work that has given us the resources that have been updated and that they are going to present to you now. So having those come from suppliers who are deeply experienced and deal with these matters across their careers provides fantastic guidance for improving product availability and delivering improved shopper satisfaction in what we all want to be a really enjoyable and prosperous summer period. So it's a very important part of what we do, and it is an adjunct, not an alternative, to detailed and internal trading partner planning, which is needing to be deployed for January. Our toolkit provides a clear and simple framework for planning and optimising key sales period over summer. So I am now going to hand over to Hamish, and he is going to take you through in a lot more detail the toolkit, and then he will hand to Matt, and then you'll see me again at the end when we go through the Q&A, and I'll then wrap up. So over to you, Hamish. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Raywyn. The checklist is here to solve an industry problem, and that's that availability over summer traditionally just hasn't been where I think the collective needs it, the retailer, the suppliers, and the consumers. So it is really a broad-based list of things that should be factored in. It is at its heart based on root cause from previous years and kind of perceived industry best practice. So it's not to replace kind of internal processes with companies, but offer in parallel a good kind of guiding light to help make sure that everything is considered when planning for the peak period. It's back to where this kind of all started. I think traditionally there was a core focus on availability or building up to Christmas, and traditionally there's been a drop-off in service over the January and February period with short weeks through to February, and people going on leave. So the battle for availability isn't kind of won at Christmas. It's through that period where there are short weeks, and that has traditionally been a large impact on availability on shelf. And I think it really should, if anything to take away from this, it's that it moves the focus on availability building up to Christmas and actually through Christmas and into January, into February, kind of at the end of Waitangi, the end of those short weeks. What some of the traditional kind of core issues that the industry has seen is that people take annual leave, and those who are normally steering the ship in January are either kind of inexperienced or someone's not quite prepared because the planning finishes at Christmas, and the public holidays impacting capacity at a transport, warehousing, and production point of view. If we flick through to the next slide, poor performance over this period. This is a really key trading period, and it has industry-wide impacts. So for the suppliers, lost sales, lost opportunity, and a lot of inefficiency through downtime and overtime if things like stock isn't built up appropriately. The retailers obviously missing share of trade and availability on shelf, and the customer ultimately don't pick up the product if it's not available on shelf. So leading to a lot of frustration, a lot of brand switching, and a lot of wasted effort. If we think of all the marketing spend, we think of the sales activity, we think of the kind of work that happens to make product available, and if it's not there, then it's all kind of wasted. So it becomes really inefficient. And if we flick through to the next slide, this shows the importance of extending the focus past Christmas and into January and February. So what you see here is Australasian data pre-2015, which shows that the availability really drops off, in particular around those short weeks. And because this is Australasian data, we have an extra stat holiday in there, so we're probably more impacted from a New Zealand level. And so that's ultimately dropping availability 4 to 5%, and that is leading to worse outcomes for the industry. So the idea is that if we really focus on this period and the extension of Christmas planning, that it will bring up availability and drive performance, both sales and category. If we flip through one more, so this is I think this is reflective data. So we've taken the kind of numbers off here, but it shows that there is still quite a lot of work to do, and it shows the period that we're talking about. Previously, in years gone by, I think, this is an industry-wide problem and no one's immune to it. Traditionally a few years ago, small suppliers over-indexed in poor performance in this period. I think more recently, especially last year over the summer just been, the bigger suppliers actually played a larger impact and were kind of over-indexing on this data. So it is an industry-wide problem, and there is an opportunity for everyone to improve holistically. So I guess the toolkit is the guiding principles of the toolkit, as you'll see as we talk through and as you kind of pick it up. I think there is a lot of focus on planning, and that's a really business-wide approach to planning in terms of upfront commercial alignment with the retailers, what that means from a forecast point of view, what that means from a production point of view, and what that means from a warehousing and transport execution point of view. I think it's a really business-wide approach. The responsiveness to issues, I think, supported with really clear internal and external communication to really help with contingency plays. And I think the importance of understanding your trading partner, there's unique kind of idiosyncrasies within categories and within retailers, but one of the core takeouts of this is that fundamentally we all want to win in this period, in particular the retailers. And I think really leaning into those conversations, one core principle is that the retailers are really open to having conversations around availability, in particular around this period, and leaning into those conversations will lead to better outcomes for everyone. The communication plan ahead of time. So again, that's a really 360 kind of responsiveness and focused on internal stakeholder alignment through suppliers, whether that's kind of raw and packed material, whether that's transport providers, whether that's warehousing. The work done ahead of the period to communicate what the operational plan is, what volume will look like, all of those things to make sure that everyone is enabled to succeed, as well as communication to the retailer and alignment on what that looks like for the customer. And then contingency planning, I think a real focus on a risk assessment based approach to what some of the issues will be over the period, and some really tangible action plans in place to mitigate those. And I think there is readiness for the known issues, and I think that sort of mindset will also drive kind of dynamic thinking. So when situations that weren't necessarily a scenario planned or haven't necessarily been contingency planned come up, at least those muscles are flexed and there's a framework there to be able to pivot and make those decisions on the fly rather than building up a plan from scratch. And this is a summary of the core points from the toolkit. And again, there's a lot of work that needs to happen up front. And this just flows through the key points. So ensuring that supply matches demand, and really that's a one number approach on availability. And there's no point having supply that there's no demand, and demand that there's no supply, and equally evaluating the amount of storage needed for raw, pack, imported material, produced material becomes really important. At the 11th hour, it's hard to find trucks, warehouses, sheds, space for those things, as well as capacity, and building up stock for shutdowns and the peak period becomes really important. And then the business alignment through the Christmas period, and again, that's visibility, risk mitigated, and clearly communicated across the business and into the retailers becomes really important. The alignment of in the supply chain, so that's again a broad-based kind of statement, but really understanding who's on leave, really understanding where the capacity exists, where the bottlenecks are, and some of the actions that are in place to mitigate those. And just emphasising that the battle's not won at Christmas. This is something that flows right through the 2 short weeks into January. Everyone takes a breath, and then we're back into more short weeks with Auckland Anniversary and Waitangi. So the importance to be ready and aligned and moving through that period, just highlighting that again. Some of the core fundamentals, we talk about the, one set of numbers, and I think that's an important piece, because then the retailer knows what to expect, your demand plan is aligned to that, and your supply plan builds to that, as well as the execution piece where you've got the right warehousing space, you've got the right transport space. So one set of numbers that is really correlated through the business is extremely important, because as we all try to be efficient and as we all try to manage those bottlenecks in our end-to-end supply chain, if we know where those are, we know what the volume that we need versus that capacity, we can really stress test the options and understand it. Speaks to the vertical integration of these and really having that full business approach. I think that plan, certainly not understated through here. So knowing what you're going to measure, knowing that your demand and your supply is strong, and you've got good continuity through your either your input plan or your production plan becomes really important. I think who you communicate those things with. Traditionally, suppliers have been really internally focused on these things, and it just really emphasizes the importance to open those up, get feedback from retailers, lean into those conversations, and again, that'll lead to a better outcome if those things are all aligned through the end-to-end. If we flip through one more, so I guess if we talk more granularly, kind of what the end-to-end looks like, really strong commercial planning with the retailers, flowing through into a demand review, flowing into a supply review, and then the factory kind of import planning and capacity becomes important. And it's also important that there's a really strong feedback loop into the demand. So positioning demand kind of over and above your capacity is going to lead to poor availability, and that's a really important kind of feedback loop to make sure that the retailers aren't disappointed with what we as an industry have promised them, and also we're not able to fulfill what ideally what we should as a supplier as well as an industry. So then that capacity planning, I think the mindset also flowing through into warehouse and transport capacity, extremely important. Also factoring in the labour capacity on both of those, and knowing there's high absenteeism through this period as well, as people take extended breaks or annual leave or kind of unplanned leave through that period. This speaks to the supplier capability portion as well, that this is really factored into securing raw materials at the right lead time to be there as needed when available. Ideally, we would have been having this webinar a few months earlier, but through no fault of anyone, we were a bit late in the piece. But the work done on this up front will really lead to the good efficiencies and good availability downstream. And the communication plan to retailers, 3PL transport is really important, because things like Saturday deliveries become a conversation. The amount of volume pushing out of supplier DCs and into retailer DCs becomes really topical over this point. So if there is a 360 approach to the communication on those, then everyone knows what's needed and what's expected. And then the scenario planning through every point of this process. If unforeseen demand comes in, what does safety stock look like? If unforeseen supply issues come in, what are the actions that can be taken to mitigate? Expedite lead times, reprioritize production, overflow warehousing, contingent transport providers, contingent raw and packed material suppliers. Having these things available and almost using them so you're not having to stand them up at peak period becomes really important. So at every point, understanding what the risks are, what the bottlenecks are, and what the game plan is, what actions you would take if you needed to do things on the known issues or potential issues, and then that will help when new and unforeseen issues come up. It's a kind of acts as a framework for pivoting and making decisions dynamically. So if we focus on the upfront, the commercial alignment, extremely important. I think if the commercial insights, what consumers are going to pick up over this period, reviewing that the demand and suppliers align to that, identifying any kind of gaps in the supply and demand or the gaps to expectation, and then managing that internally and communicating to that 360, hugely important. At parts, this toolkit tries to bring together that commercial alignment. So a sales focus, a supply reality, and kind of a business context become really important. The toolkit tries to wrap all of those together with a view on availability and that alignment. So we're not having a conversation and making promises that we can't fulfill in the back end. We push through to capacity. Again, this is understanding what the bottlenecks are. This is taking the demand plan and supply plan and understanding how achievable that is through infrastructure. Is it a case of needing to bring on more transport, more trucks, internal or external, more warehousing, and understanding what the levers are there? Because if that becomes your bottleneck, ultimately that will stop you getting availability on shelf at the key kind of moment of truth. The high risk and kind of variable portions of portfolio or equipment and infrastructure, what are the things that need to happen to mitigate some of those, whether that's holding more inventory, BCP suppliers, become really important to the capacity play, and also the risk assessment view. And on capability, it's really important to understand what your 3PLs can do, whether that's pulling containers off the wharf, whether that's raw and packed material suppliers, whether that's transport. If they understand the volumes and timing, and that's really well aligned up front, then no one will be let down through the end-to-end. That will mean that there are different communication requirements, and at times an established kind of matrix of escalation. And these things mean that in the moment, it's really clear cut what needs to happen, rather than reaching and trying to find the communication matrix or the demand requirements. They're already there. I think another piece in capability is also who's on leave. So often the key decision makers are on leave, and that hasn't been delegated effectively, and so it slows down that decision making when the people who make the decision aren't available. So if that's really clearly defined, then people can kind of pivot easily, make those decisions through that what is traditionally an annual leave period. And I think to touch on the kind of last key point there is contingency. So really can't stress this enough. I mean, this is kind of supply chain, so things do often go wrong, as we're all kind of aware. So there is an upfront portion to this, whether that's managing risk through manufacturing lines or understanding BCPs, but then also there's a check-act routine that needs to be established on the performance through the period, and understanding what would happen through there, whether that's changes in transport, warehousing requirements, competitor activity, or kind of retailer activations for that period, and being able to understand where you are at any given point will lead to quicker decision making. And if we flip through, this is a snipping. This is kind of an example of the key points that are in the toolkit, in the checklist. So who's accountable, what it is, and really making sure that we understand what the issues were last year that held us back, and making sure that there is an action in place for some of those root cause, and then also provides a really strong lens into how we should be preparing for this year, with things, with a lot of key prompts across the categories we've just spoken to. This is available online at the moment. There's a plug for the website down the bottom. And I will pass over to Matt, and he will give some more detailed examples of where the toolkit has become useful.
Cool. Thanks, Hamish. And thanks, Raywin and the FGC for having me along today. So like Hamish touched on, I'm here to share where I found the toolkit valuable, and we'll give a couple of examples along the way. I'll just start up front that, at Arnix, we're certainly not perfect in this space, but I can definitely say that we have seen improvements when the toolkit's followed and when we have that buy-in from the key stakeholders. And first up, I've always found the toolkit has a positive impact on our internal collaboration when it comes to preparing for summer trading. Our logistics and sales teams actually had a winning in summer check-in yesterday, and we'll have several of these in the lead up to Christmas and then beyond Christmas as well. Like most things, having regular check-ins really does help, as things can change pretty quickly in this industry, and you don't want to leave too much to chance. And working through the key points on the toolkit is a really easy way to facilitate discussions across departments, particularly between sales and logistics. I've sat on both sides and found it valuable in both instances, but particularly when I was in a sales role, when I started my career, it certainly gave me a greater understanding and appreciation for our supply chain and help with my comms back to the retailers. And for me personally, the toolkit works best when there is that collective input and not just left to one department to do the heavy lifting. It's also good to allocate who's responsible for each point to create that ownership and accountability. I also recommend that it's good to bring the newer team members on the journey as well. So definitely don't be afraid to get your account execs, or if you've got a junior or a new supply chain team member, get them involved. It certainly increases the understanding of the key selling period in the FMCG industry. And I'm sure, like most businesses who are online today, will have a fairly robust supply and demand planning process. But to give you an example, we had a check-in yesterday, like I said, and in that discussion, it actually raised a late adjustment to phasing of volume that could have been missed otherwise. And I'm sure through our processes, we would have picked it up at some point by getting onto that early. It allowed us to communicate quickly to our 3PL, so they could then make adjustments to their staffing plan, which they've already locked in for over the next 3 months. So it's just a really small example of where the toolkit adds value. And further touching on further with the external collaboration, that's another area where I think it adds great value when you do use a toolkit. And the toolkit does have a checklist item related to transport and warehouse planning, which in our case at Arnix is with external providers. So having your internal processes locked down becomes more or less worthless if your external parties are not aligned to your plans. And the last thing you want is obviously to be let down at the final hurdle. So after using the toolkit for a few years, it's standard practice for us now at Arnix to have joint meetings with our 3PL and our transport providers to ensure we're across the expected demand, who the key contacts will be over the holiday and wider summer period, and any changes to their operating hours. And I've certainly found the toolkit keeps us accountable to having those meetings and ensures that they are held and effectively ticked off on the checklist. Sort of got to the point by doing that it's really just standard practice for us now, and the team expects that this is what's going to happen. And like I touched on, it just creates that alignment and that shared accountability. And if I was going to give a key tip from me on this, and feel free to learn from my mistakes, is that to ensure you do have that clear alignment with your external parties on their operating hours over that summer period, whether that's transport, warehouse, or something else, but particularly on those short weeks and around Christmas, like Hamish touched on. I remember a few years back when one of our providers finished early on Christmas Eve and we didn't have alignment to that plan. Something as simple as shutting down a couple of hours early resulted in missed deliveries and therefore missed sales and product on shelf. So, by having that clear alignment up front, we would have avoided lost sales, the retailers as well, lost scan sales, and then of course would have reduced out of stocks on shelf. So something that we definitely didn't want to repeat again. Also, another one for me, just as was important for the suppliers online today, is that the toolkit can be used by all suppliers, regardless of business size. At Arnott's, we're a fairly large business who manufactures a lot of product in Australia, and these products come out of big factories that are largely working to set schedules to accommodate demand from multiple customers across multiple countries. So we largely work around these schedules, shutdowns, and capacity, and it's big volumes that respond to price and promo. So early collaboration and alignment with our team in Aussie is key to ensure the volume is produced with good dates that meets the demand. We then, of course, need to have the containers ready to ship it over, and the toolkit has checklist points which prompt all of this, including sure we have alignment with the retailers on their promo plans, and that's something that's really critical for us when you factor in longer lead times. And it's not uncommon for us internally when we do have our summer check-ins. You'll often hear, a team member might say, let me check with Australia on their shutdown plans, or I can reach out to the shipping lines to confirm they can accommodate that change, or more internally with the retailers, I need to get confirmation of their Christmas display pans. Now, this is all stuff that forms part of the puzzle, and it will be standard practice for a lot of suppliers out there, but the toolkit just gives it extra attention for when it matters most over that key summer period. I guess the flip side to a large business like we've got at Arnott's is sort of the flip side we've got here, where I'm actually based today at Avondale. We have a smaller manufacturing site here, which is definitely a bit more agile and operates like a smaller business. And the toolkit still applies to smaller sites or smaller businesses. It's obviously always best practice to have your plans locked in nice and early, but when I think about applying the toolkit to a more agile site, it raises some different questions through our discussions, and that could be, can we run a second shift or weekend shifts to meet the demand? Or we're expecting an increase in sales, so can the yard accommodate the additional trucks? Do we need additional storage? So I guess my point here is, regardless of business size, it's still worthwhile reviewing the checklist, as it may create opportunity for you or mitigate some risk. And even if you don't have formal meetings with the retailers, just use the toolkit for yourself, because I'm sure it will add value to any business, regardless of the size, big or small. And then the final point from me, just from my experience, I've found the years where we put the most focus on using the toolkit, we've typically had the best alignment with the retailers over the summer period, and therefore better results. Using the toolkit, it definitely takes some buy-in, and I know when I was on the sales side of the fence, I didn't quite have the same passion for it as I do now, but we all just want to sell product, and you can't make that sale if you don't have the supply. So that collaboration and getting the buy-in certainly benefits everyone. And like, I touched on earlier at Hamish as well, every business is going to have their own processes, as do retailers, but the toolkit's just a great way to provide a framework that creates that internal and external alignment. And, whether that's good news or bad news, at least it provides a framework where you can communicate to that. It certainly drives some accountability and ownership as well, and it's ultimately there to improve service levels across the industry, which is something that we all want. That's it for me.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Hamish. That was a really fantastic overview of the toolkit. Lots of really good examples, lots of reasons why it's really important to plan. And I guess what really impacted me was the fact that there's been so much thinking and design work go into the checklists that it's a really great template to help any business, as you say, Matt, to either check what you're doing and have focused conversations and motivate your team, but also to, if you're starting from scratch as a small supplier or a new supplier or just a supplier that hasn't focused on this before, a lot of the hard work is already done for you. And because we've worked with the retailers to develop this toolkit, we're really confident that it's a great starting place for any business in our FMCG world to have a good look at what they're doing and get really super prepared for a great summer. So we are really keen to hear whether people on the webinar have any questions for Matt or Hamish. I can't see any in the chat or in the Q&A at the moment, but please do pop them in there if you do have any questions. We did have a little list of questions that we thought we would use to get the ball rolling. So I will start with that and see if any questions come through to the chat or Q&A. So the first question is, can you think of what initially motivated you to look at your summer supply planning in this program? And I guess before I hand over and open it up to Matt and Hamish to comment on that, I certainly know that when I started in the role at the Food and Grocery Council and met with retailers and actually met with some store owners just after summer, it was January last year, this was top of mind. And this was something that they all raised with me and said, we're not very good at doing this. We've come out of COVID, which was really challenging, but we haven't really got back to where we were pre-COVID. And it would be something, Raywin, if you could help support this work to get the message out to suppliers to plan early and plan well and use resources rather than, I guess, an ad hoc approach, it would be better for everybody in the industry and it would be really fantastic for our consumers as well. So that's really where I first came across the real need for this. But I'll hand over and open it up. Hamish or Matt, do you have any comment from your experience when this first sort of appeared as an issue in your careers?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we have a lot of key activations over summer. There's a lot of categories in Nestle and products we push over summer, and it's the return on investment that we weren't fulfilling was an issue for us. I think that was probably the biggest one. We had a missed top line opportunity, and I think the inherent inefficiencies that it drove as well. So we either had too much warehousing space, or we were running overtime at factories, or whatever we were doing, we were adding kind of waste, where we were sprinting, where we hadn't prepped well enough, or we hadn't got it right up front, and we had too much product. So those are probably the big things for me.
Excellent, thanks. Hamish, anything from you, Matt?
Yep, very similar. And I think, just from my point of view, as I reflect back, is that often we make the same mistakes year on year. And by having something like the toolkit and having these catch-ups with a wider group of people, we've really tried to take that initiative of learning from the mistakes or things that we think will happen. So that's really become part of our process now. And I think the toolkit, like I touched on, is that it's just great to get other departments involved in that as well, and not leaving it in isolation.
Thank you. I guess one thing that also occurred to me as you were talking is we've had a lot of negative weather events that have made life even more challenging, not just during summer, but particularly at summer when that peak demand and people on holiday as well all comes together. So I guess as a small sort of stringy country with not the greatest infrastructure, and we've had reliability issues with infrastructure as well across Cook Strait and then various other issues as well, that it really means that the planning that you do in the scenario contingency stuff is going to come to the fore probably more often than we would hope. Do you guys have any comment on those types of factors that have been at play in the last few years? Good.
Yeah. I mean, you name it. We've just seen the Manildra silos collapse in Australia over the weekend. So, that's a big supplier of glucose in Australasia. So these are the things that you don't expect to be dealing with at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, and these are the things that do happen. So it's the more you do it, I think through COVID we did a really good job of understanding what the contingencies were going to be and having a plan in place. I think we then kind of, as COVID, the focus on COVID kind of diminished, I think our readiness and our responsiveness and the amount of thought we put into BCPs and contingencies kind of dropped off. And so, again, it doesn't take much to have a wake-up call like trying to find glucose to really kind of bring that back into the check.
Thanks, Hamish. Matt?
Yeah, not directly related to weather, but weather just popped into my head then is, we import a big chunk of product from Australia, and often industrial action happens sort of in that November, December timing, and it seems to happen every year. It's sort of the best time for them to agitate and do that. So kind of once again, learning from my mistakes of it could happen. So you build those contingencies in to give yourself some buffer, and that may mean holding a bit extra inventory or having to work a bit closer with our shipping providers on that. But it's those type of things that we definitely factor in now to our planning.
Great, thank you. And if we move to sort of wrap up from here, we haven't got any questions coming through, and that must mean you've done a fantastic job presenting a lot of information, and maybe people are really keen to have a look at the checklist. And of course, we can always take questions after the event with the email address that we're going to provide shortly. So are there any final comments that either of you want to make before we move to wrap up?
Well, I think just for me, Raymond, and kind of just reiterating the points like I touched on, is that I've personally found great value in using the toolkit, and I would just encourage anyone, suppliers out there who are using it or aren't, just to really give it a go and lean into it, and just see if you can bring more people on their journey, particularly thinking about my experience from starting off in sales and then moving into a more operations, logistics type of role. I probably didn't give it the due diligence and thought when I was on that sales side. So I've really tried to take an active role internally now to bring other departments on the journey with that, because, you know, like I said, like, we need the product to sell and we all want it, and we all collectively want the retailers and the supermarkets to have a great summer period so we can all enjoy it with all the product that we want available. So just really encourage everyone just to download the toolkit and just give it a crack, really.
Sounds great. Any final words from you, Hamish?
Yeah, look, I think it's obviously a point in time where we want to win, and I think that drives the need to look at it further than just business as usual. It's I think I shouldn't say poor performance. The previous performance dictates that there is a real opportunity here for everyone, and the fact that it is such an important period of time, even if your categories don't activate through this period or it's off season for you, everyone is impacted by holidays, by stat days, by shutdowns. So there is something in this for everyone. And I think the flip side is, yes, there is a big focus today in the conversation around Christmas and summer period. There is also an application for these guiding principles or this toolkit in other peak periods of your business, whether you activate over Easter, whether you activate at Halloween, whatever your seasonality is. You can very easily kind of plug and play this to your peak season and make it more relevant to your business.
It's a fantastic way to finish, that this toolkit is actually really useful everyday business planning. There'll be other times that it comes into the fore where you have other focus events in your business, so you can tweak it and make it really work well for your business and your particular circumstances. So in terms of next steps, we are going to do a little bit more on this for the summer. It is late, as has been acknowledged, but raising awareness is never a wasted effort, because there's always next summer, there's always Easter, there's always the benefit of planning, as we've just talked about, all year round. So you'll see some of this material hopefully on social media. You'll certainly see it on our website, and we've got the email there, which we will make available to all of the participants of this webinar as a follow-up. So if you do have questions that you either didn't want to ask in the webinar or that you think of later, or when you have a look at the checklist, something doesn't make sense, please feel free to use that admin@fgc.org.nz email, and we will come back to you with some further information to assist you. So, and look out for the Let's Make This Summer the Best Stocked Yet material, because that might be something you want to share. It might help you and your company get more awareness about the fact that this is a industry-wide campaign that we're running with support of the retailers, with the input of a wide industry group, to make sure it's a great toolkit and set of resources to help you. So look out for that. In terms of other things that New Zealand Food and Grocery Council are up to, this is one of 5 webinars that we're running this month. It's a particularly busy month for us. 2 of those are in conjunction with the Commerce Commission. There's a lot of activity there, a wholesale supply inquiry underway, and also the launch of the disputes resolution process. So we've got webinars coming up on both of those. We've partnered again with the retailers and also with GS1 to do a digital labelling webinar coming up later in the month on the 30th, and that will be open to non-members as well. Yesterday we had one with Ministry for Women on gender pay gap, completely different but very important for our sector to have a view on the reporting tool that's being developed by the Ministry for Women, and that was a great session for the people that attended that workshop. On Thursday night in Auckland this week, we have Lisa King addressing future leaders at an event in the evening, and that also is open to non-members. There's information on LinkedIn on that and on our website. It's not too late to register. So if you haven't and you're interested, particularly if you're an emerging leader in FMCG, we would love to see you there. And then on the 11th to the 13th of November, we have our annual conference, Shared Horizons, in our capital city, Wellington, at Tākina, the new convention centre. We are really thrilled to have both retailers represented. Woolworths, Foodstuffs, North Island and South Island will be presenting to delegates at that conference. We also have a range of speakers, including the Grocery Commissioner from the Commerce Commission. We have a couple of ministers speaking, and we are really thrilled to have Tāna Umanga as one of our inspirational speakers. So if you haven't looked at the program for our conference and are interested, please do. Our early bird registrations close off in about a week, and we'll be sending out the program to remind people later today. So thank you all very much for your attendance, but a huge thank you to both Hamish and Matt for all of your work that you've done, to the entire New Zealand Food and Grocery Council Supply Chain Working Group for all of the mahi that they've done over the years to develop this toolkit and then refine it for today's webinar. Thanks also to Holly, Casey, and the team at New Zealand Food and Grocery Council, who are absolutely integral to us having successful webinars, particularly 5 in 1 month. So thank you to them, and we'll be in touch with all of the participants with some follow-up information. But thanks so much for attending today. Enjoy the rest of your week. Ka kite.